Theodore's Lament by K.A. Gass. The door to the exam room opened. In stepped a chubby middle-aged nurse. Theo thought she looked like a psychic from one of those old black-and-white adventure films. Her dreaded hair was peeking out from under a vibrant head wrap. She had garnet ombre lips and silver teardrop earrings. If this was a movie, a glowing crystal ball would illuminate her face as she delivered a cryptic portent to an ill-starred protagonist, he thought. The nutty scent of argan oil and lavender filled Theo's nostrils as she leaned in to check his heart. If it wasn't for her blue scrubs, Theo might mistake the nurse for a French Quarter voodoo priestess. But every voodooist Theo remembered from those films was a slender Creole woman with dark, enigmatic eyes. This nurse was a white, plump woman, and her dreads were auburn. Enigmatic may be the last word Theo would use to describe this nurse. In fact, he felt like he could predict her entire personality before she even spoke. A white woman who describes herself as spiritual. She's not religious, but she's filled her house with Buddha figurines. Her bedroom has a mandala tapestry draped on the wall with string lights. She has a BLM yard sign, but regularly calls the cops about suspicious cars on her street. "My name is Rebecca. Can you confirm your name and date of birth for me, please?" asked the nurse. Becky for short, thought Theo. Theodore Thériault, Theriault, December 13th, 1999. I go by Theo for short. His mother was the last person who still called him Theodore. She was adamant that everyone would call her baby Theodore, not Theo or Teddy. It wasn't long before his cousins and even his father called him Teddy for short. His mom never gave up the fight for the name Theodore, though. Not when all his friends called him Theo, or even when he told her he preferred to go by Theo. He often joked that she should have picked a name that didn't have a common nickname. When naming his younger brothers, she evaded names with obvious monikers. Despite her best efforts, Jacques and Antoine went by Jack and Tony. Theo's mom never stopped correcting people when they used their nicknames, though. She always struggled accepting things outside of her control. Theo watched the blood from his forearm spurt inside a little glass test tube. His fingers were already numb. "This is just a routine test. You get like this every time," he reminded himself. He dug the fingernail of his middle finger into his thumb to check if there was still feeling. Yes, there is, he thought. Whenever Theo's anxiety subsided, the numbness he felt in his fingers followed soon after. The same happened when he experienced a racing heartbeat, vertigo, or blurred vision. Theo knew his symptoms were psychosomatic. Still, he couldn't resist partaking in his anxious rituals, like testing for numbness with a fingernail. He got tested for HIV every 3 months, as the CDC recommends. This should feel like routine, but the 20-minute wait for results still overwhelmed Theo. Before the wait, however, there was a risk assessment questionnaire. "Are you sexually active?" asked Becky. "Yes," said Theo. "Do you have sex with multiple partners?" "Yes." Theo shifted in his seat. "Do you have sex with other men, or with women who have sex with men who have sex with other men?" Why are these always worded like a fucking riddle, thought Theo. "Yes. Sex with men, I mean." "Have you had sexual contact with an African-American or Latino partner?" asked Becky. "I am black," said Theo. He couldn't help himself. These questions are standard. They just help patients think about potential risk factors. Certain demographics are at higher risk of infection, Nurse Becky explained. Theo knew all of this, of course. They asked the same questions every time. It still bothered him to hear as a gay black man. Dying of AIDS would be bad enough. Knowing they would remember him as a cliché, a stereotype, made his face hot with shame. "Yes, I've had sex with black men. And Latino men." "Do you use condoms every time?" asked Becky. "Yes." That wasn't entirely true. At least he didn't have unprotected every time. He knew several guys who did. Theo stared despondently as Becky discarded the needle and bloody cotton ball. "I will be back with the results," Becky said while gathering the questionnaire and blood samples. Theo again thought about Becky being a voodooist from the golden age of Hollywood. These things would be her divination tools, he thought. In place of throwing chicken bones and reading tea leaves, they have stethoscopes and centrifuges. Then again, thought Theo, it's probably for the best that this isn't a movie. Gay black boys don't fare well in movies. They die of AIDS or get beaten to death by a mob of bigots. The questionnaire was always awkward, but for Theo, the worst part was waiting. At most, the questionnaire took a few minutes, meaning he had around 15 minutes to wait in this quiet, fluorescent, bleach-scented cube. Theo checked his thumb for numbness again. Yep, still feel it. Theo knew he should meditate. His therapist had recommended it to him so many times. Theo checked his phone instead. Only 1 minute had passed since Becky left. Theo opened Instagram. No signal in the clinic. What if it's positive, he thought, followed by, you've been through this loop a dozen times. Why should this time be any different? It's not like you have any symptoms. Theo felt his nail digging into his thumb. But what if? He thought again. Theo's therapist once told him to try answering these questions, he asked himself. One reason catastrophizing causes such misery is because it only begs the question, Dr. Shepard said. You're imagining a horrible scenario and questioning what will happen if that worst-case scenario comes true. Yes? Don't leave the questions unanswered. Don't assume your life would be over. Instead, tell yourself what actions you will take. Action is the antidote to fear. Knowing that there is an action you can take will help you combat your fear. Theo went to work answering his fear. So, if it's positive, he thought, step 1, contacting my previous partner. Or does the CDC do that for me? Step 2, keep my job at all costs. Unemployment means no health insurance. What if you lose your job for reasons outside of your control? HIV turns into AIDS if you don't keep taking medicine. This was no good. Now Theo was stressing about his job, too. No, don't let the question hang. Answer it, too. Well, I guess I'll have to move to a state with expanded Medicaid while I look for a new job. Theo thought like this for a while before realizing his fear had, in fact, subsided a bit. Even if the worst-case scenario happens, I won't die from AIDS today. Theo would do whatever it takes to keep fighting. He was nothing if not a fighter. After a few moments, a fresh fear sprouted up in his mind. What would my parents say? I haven't spoken to her in years, not since I left. Theo closed his eyes, recalling the home he left behind. Theo felt a painful, yet familiar stab of his pointer fingernail into his calloused thumb. His mother reached across the kitchen table, squeezing his hand, interrupting his anxious ritual. Theo was always anxious when his dad came home like this. Marcus was still outside, but by the speed with which he pulled into the gravel drive, both Theo and his mother could feel his rage in the air. Theo's father was often angry. His anger was enough to ruin evenings, weekends, and holidays. When Marcus's mood soured, it consumed the entire home. By the time Theo reached grade school, he could detect the slightest trigger that caused his father's mood to shift, even when the rest of his family thought it came out of nowhere. His father wasn't angry all the time either. Deep down, he was good-natured. In Theo's mind, Marcus's anger was usually justified. Marcus's job didn't pay enough, even when he worked 60-hour weeks. His father's employer often pushed him into working long hours of overtime at the factory with the dangling promise of a promotion and pay raise. The pay raise never came, despite his tremendous effort. Unfortunately for Marcus, the factory was still the best-paying job in Blue Springs, Mississippi. Even including his mother's salary, Estelle was a teacher, their family barely made enough to scrape by. Scraping by was not enough for his father. Marcus wanted to send Teddy to college to become an engineer. Why hadn't his father left the small town in rural Mississippi in search of a better job? He had considered leaving Blue Springs. Marcus found a job that paid better in Madison, Alabama, and Estelle had found a teaching position nearby. The problem with this plan was Theo's grandmother. Adele had lived in Blue Springs all her life and wasn't keen on leaving now. But Theo's grandmother relied on his parents for transportation and home maintenance. Marcus tried to convince his mother to move with them, but she wouldn't hear of it. Grandma Adele insisted they go. She said she would be fine on her own. They all knew she wouldn't be. Even though the pay increase would be significant, it still wouldn't cover the cost of hiring in-home aid for Adele, not even close. At one point, Theo thought he'd stumbled on a solution to free his father from this web. It was his sophomore year of high school, and Theo had saved up enough waiting tables to purchase a used Corolla. Theo proposed to his dad that he move to Madison with his mother for the better paying jobs and let him stay here and take care of Grandma. "What happens in 2 years when you leave for college?" his father asked. "I think I should stay here for a while and get a full-time job at the factory till we convince Grandma to move," Theo said, thinking this would make his father beam with delight. "Plus, I don't want you to pressure yourself to send me to college. It's just a social club for rich white kids nowadays." Marcus wasn't delighted. That day was the first time Theo saw his father weep. He never brought up his brilliant solution again. Theo didn't go to college, as it turns out. After coming out, he didn't have much contact with his family. Sometimes he talked to his brothers or dad on the phone. Sometimes his dad sent him money when he really needed it. But Theo couldn't stay in Blue Springs. His mother had hurt him too badly, and he followed his instinct to flee. Even when his father reached out a year later, he was still too angry to speak to his mom. At one point, she even had the nerve to ask what people at the church would think of her having a gay son. Theo didn't remember anyone from the First Baptist Church keeping Estelle company when her husband was working nights and weekends. No one from the church skipped sleepovers with friends to cheer her up when Dad was in a mood. She tossed him aside to preserve a social status she never actually had. Theo was still so angry when his father reached out months later. He rushed off the phone before Marcus could suggest putting his mother on. For all Theo knew, his mother didn't want to speak to him either. She hadn't spent much effort to reach him. No doubt she had felt abandoned when he left Blue Springs and came to New Orleans. Theo's thumb was throbbing. His nail had been digging in for minutes. How could he reach out now? His first call to them to tell them he had a deadly disease? The air conditioning kicking in interrupted the silence in the exam room. Theo realized he had been through this exact scenario before. Routine testing leading to intense anxiety and wondering how he would tell friends and family. This time will be no different, he told himself. Nurse Becky will walk through that door and tell me it's negative. Theo made a deal with God. If this test was negative, he would reach out to his mother this time. Theo felt a semblance of calm wash over him. He was going to be okay. The door handle to the exam room jiggled as if someone was opening it. The jiggling stopped. There was a sound of people talking outside, but Theo couldn't make out the words. "Don't overthink it." But it was too late. Theo could feel his heart racing. After another minute, which seemed like an eternity, Nurse Becky walked into the room. No doubt she had done this many times, but her poker face was pitiful. Theo could feel her tension in the air, like the way he could tell when his father's mood shifted before anyone else. "Please confirm your name and date of birth." "Theodore Thériault, December 13th, 1999, Theo said as if his mouth were on autopilot. He felt like the room was spinning. "The rapid test came back positive for HIV, the nurse stated in a neutral tone. When Theo didn't react, she continued. "Of course, this is the rapid, so we are sending a sample for testing to confirm." It felt like gravity had ceased to exist. The room was turning end over end. "How common is it?" asked Theo. "A false positive." "An inaccurate result on a rapid is typically a false negative, which is why we still ask people with a negative rapid test to wait until The second test result comes back before they have sexual contact. So I certainly have it, Theodore said, followed by a sharp inhale. His mind was racing. You're going to die from this. Not today, but one day this will kill you. Theodore, listen to me. Try not to get ahead of yourself. I will help you through this process today. Before you leave here, we will contact your doctor to set up a follow-up appointment. You'll need to wait a couple days. A couple days? What do I do until then? I just go to work not knowing if I'm going to die? Becky interjected. This is exactly what I mean by don't get ahead of yourself. If you don't have anyone you can confide in immediately, I'm happy to give you my personal number. Who can I tell? James, thought Theo. James would be safe to tell. It's shocking this didn't happen to him instead. Theo was pressing his nail into his thumb like he was trying to draw blood. His roommate had a new man in his room every weekend. This is so fucking unfair, he thought. Theo noticed Rebecca's green eyes searching his face. In fact, Theo, I'm going to enter my cell number into your phone before you leave. As far as work, we can help you submit FMLA leave while we get this figured out, Rebecca continued. As far as treatment, there have been massive breakthroughs. Many doctors consider HIV less serious a diagnosis than diabetes. Do you have health insurance through this employer? He had to focus to remember what she just asked him. Yes, answered Theo. It's good you have coverage already, and if you need to take medical leave from work, they can't fire you. There's also government programs to assist with initial treatment costs. Theo had no response. Theodore, were you the victim of sexual assault? I asked there's additional financial help if you contracted the virus through forced sexual contact. It wasn't he couldn't finish the sentence. A lump had formed in his throat. Theo continued in a frail voice. It was consensual, I mean. Most times I use a condom, but he kept asking and cold tears were streaming down his burning cheeks. I wanted him to like me. Theo sobbed, head hung, shoulders heaving. You're pathetic, Theo thought. You were more careful than any of your friends, for nothing. Theo felt Rebecca's hand on his back. Theo lost track of how long he had been in this state. The appointment continued after he calmed down, but he was just going through the motions. The intense release of adrenaline subsided and left him feeling exhausted. Rebecca was silent again, those green eyes shifting back and forth, studying him. Go home and try to rest. You've been through a lot. And don't hesitate to reach out, Theodore. Yeah, definitely, Theodore said, nodding his head. Theo couldn't bring himself to look in her eyes. He felt embarrassed by his breakdown, even though he knew he couldn't help it. Rebecca inhaled like she was about to say something, and then hesitated. Theo, remember not to let your thoughts get the best of you. Today was hard, but getting tested often was responsible of you. Catching this early makes all the difference. Rebecca lifted his chin to meet her eyes. This isn't going to be the death of you, Theodore. HIV isn't going to kill you today. Theodore met her kind eyes, wondering if they really knew his fate, or if she just wanted to comfort him. Theo stepped outside the Planned Parenthood. It was a more beautiful day than August had any right to be. A breeze was blowing off Lake Pontchartrain, cutting through the city's heat. The air's earthy notes reminded Theo of summers as a child. He used to play in the park till after dark. Then he would walk to the local movie rental shop, where his mother worked during summer break. I should have never left there. At least I could have avoided this. Theo doubted he'd sleep that night. He didn't have enough strength to fight the intrusive thoughts. No, you must stop letting terror control you. You are no more a dead man than you were this morning. He reminded himself to follow Rebecca's plan. I'm going to go home, eat something. Theo still had a Xanax prescription to use as needed. That's something. Theo exited the gate surrounding the Planned Parenthood. There were voices shouting to his left. Then Theo felt something wet smack against his face. What the fuck? Theo looked up to a horde of protesters with hand-painted "Abortion is murder" signs. Several of them were holding tomatoes. "What in the fuck are you doing?" Theo said, swiping at his face and flinging the red slime off his hands. Sorry, I thought you were a woman," said a 20-something blonde guy in a pastel polo, sunglasses, and cargo pants. He was holding a sign with baby footprints and the words, "Black Babies Lives Matter." "You fucking shitty asshole! What the fuck is wrong with you?" Theo's adrenaline was back. He couldn't decide if he wanted to rip this guy's limbs off or break down crying. "I already said I was sorry. You don't have to be a dick," the blonde protester said, taken aback. Theo was fighting back tears again as he stormed off past the protesters to the sidewalk. His heart was racing. It felt like electricity was shooting through his body. He reached up and placed 2 fingers on his throat to check his pulse. Rapid rhythm, tight chest, shallow breathing, tunnel vision. The lump in his throat was threatening to choke him. Theo sucked in air. "I should have never come to this city." Theo hated his father for refusing his offer to stay in Blue Springs. He hated his mother for discarding him like trash. In this moment, he hated his best friend James most of all. He had men pining over him, but James rebuffed them to maintain his philandering lifestyle. James fucked 10 different guys a month. Theo weaved in and out of pedestrians, bumping into shoulders when there wasn't space. The crosswalk light ahead counted down, 9 seconds remaining. Theo increased his pace to a jog. He couldn't stand being in public any longer, yet knew once he got home he'd be all alone with his fears. "This isn't fair. I know guys who fuck strangers in club bathrooms. Why me? Why God?" The mid-afternoon sun was baking Theo's face, sweat pouring down his neck. "Rebecca's plan didn't account for the insurmountable problem of my broken fucking brain. She said I would feel calmer after I ate. Fucking worthless." When Theo reached 7th Street, he broke out into a run. His heartbeat was throbbing in his ears now. "You're a goddamn fool. You thought a guy who pressured you into raw sex in a Motel 6 could somehow become a boyfriend?" Theo realized in that moment the source of his resentment for James. James had sex for fun. You just want someone to love you. It was Friday. James would be home at 5. Theo would face the choice of pretending nothing was wrong or breaking down in front of his roommate he detested. He knew he didn't really hate James. He hated himself for leaving home. He hated himself for being so desperate for love that he discarded his own safety. He hated himself for wasting years in perfect health, convinced he was dying. He hated himself most of all for falling into despair now when he should be fighting. Theo only had a few blocks left to his apartment and had half a mind to turn around and run the other way. His legs continued forward as if on autopilot. The crosswalk sign in front of him switched to red, and Theo skid to a halt. He pressed the crosswalk button over and over in frustration. A woman in black behind him looked over in concern, and he ceased pressing it. Theo closed his eyes, not caring if the people around him thought him crazy. In the darkness behind his eyelids, a memory he'd suppressed crept back into his mind. Months ago, Theo matched on a dating app with a guy who was exactly his type. Tall, piercing blue eyes. They even had a great conversation going. But when Theo saw the man was HIV positive, he unmatched without an explanation. Theo knew there was little risk with an undetectable partner, but it was something else that disturbed him. The man was 2 years younger than him. How long before the same happens to me, he thought. Theo had felt guilty at the time for unmatching, but now he felt overwhelming doom. Who is going to love you now? You'll be just like that guy you ghosted. Men will see you as a contagion, or worse, they'll run because you remind them of their own fears. It's over. Now you'll never find the one. The crosswalk light changed to a walking stick figure. Theo broke into a run. A moment too late, he heard the lady in black behind him yelling, "Wait!" Theo saw a bright, sapphire sky above him. The bustle and noise of New Orleans faded behind a faint ringing in his ears. The last thing Theo remembered was standing at the crosswalk, watching a red hand transition into a cyan stick figure. Theo never saw the truck barreling towards his left side. The driver of the truck must have seen the green light next to the left turn yield on green sign. The driver must have forgotten to yield to the crosswalk too. Theo reached up towards his aching head. He felt a jolt of alarm as he pulled his hand back, covered in his own blood. The truck was only crawling. Its impact wasn't all that great. The impact was, however, enough to knock Theo off his feet. The pavement did the rest. Dying. I'm fucking dying. This was no time for humor, but Theo found it amusing. He'd spent so much of his life ruminating about his demise, but never saw this coming. Wispy silver clouds were drifting across the baby blue sky above him. It's gorgeous out. I wish they didn't have to find out about me on such a beautiful day, thought Theo. James, my brothers, Dad, and Mom. How soon before they each got a call? Paramedics are on the way, sweetheart. The lady in black was kneeling next to him. Theo strained to hear her above the ringing in his ears. Don't worry, honey. You're going to be okay. Theo knew he wasn't going to be okay. Not this time. Funnily enough, it was the precise reason he didn't need to worry. Not anymore. The lady in black grasped his hand, giving a squeeze to comfort him. Theo gave her a feeble squeeze back. She didn't look a day over 40, but Theo could feel the real age in her hands. Supple, wrinkled skin sliding over delicate bones. They felt like his mother's hands. Theo felt a sharp sadness, realizing he'd never clasp his mother's hands again. Theo's mom tried to reach out after he left Blue Springs. The dread of rejection kept him from calling back. If only I'd realized how trivial evading fear was when weighed against telling my mom I love her one more time. Not telling her I'm sorry for leaving. Not telling her I forgive her for how things ended. It's all going to be all right, the lady in black whispered. She's right, of course. Mom will be all right. She always was the toughest in our family. Above Theo, the driver of the truck was cursing, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. It was like all Theo's terror before the accident had evaporated. Theo found it curious that now that he was actually dying, he was at peace. The driver had his hands clutched above his head, looking down at the pool of red blood below him. Their gazes crossed. Theo saw the panic in the driver's eyes. I wish I could tell him it will be okay. He shouldn't worry. Worrying doesn't help anything. Theo closed his eyes. He'd forgotten what he was thinking about. The thought seemed like it had been important, but when Theo tried to recall it, the memory evaded him. He didn't remember where he was or how he got there. He forgot why he needed to care. Teetering on the edge of what felt like deep sleep, Theo ran his thumb back and forth, caressing the familiar wrinkled hand. Theo stared off into the pale blue sky, grateful he got to hold his mother's hand one last time.